These happy days for the Floyds quickly became overshadowed by poor economic times. Farmers were the first to feel the oncoming Great Depression, and by 1925, farm prices were plummeting. As families lost their crops, banks foreclosed on their farms. Retaliation by social bandits, as they were called, sprung up everywhere. And before long, Charlie Floyd saw a new opportunity to make ends meet.
He was apparently trying to make an honest living as well as he could. He had Ruby, his pretty young wife, his little baby boy, but still he had those itchy feet. Charlie's big waltz on that line, separating good for evil, really took a turn for the worse, if you will, back in 1925. That's when he went big time.
Charlie grabbed some friends and a gun, then robbed nearly $12,000 of payroll money en route from a St. Louis bank to the Kroger Grocery Company.
Charlie and one of his pals made the mistake of coming right back home. He always went back home to those beloved hills of Oklahoma. Went back to Salisaw smoking a big cigar, driving a car, and sporting some clothes, and they smelled of bay rum. They looked good.
Local police there saw Charlie Floyd coming into town, and they knew he must have been up to no good. They stopped him and frisked him and his partner and found rolls of bills on him, still with the wrappers from the Tower Grove Bank. Well, it wasn't long before Charlie was being shipped back to St. Louis. And in fact, his partner soon spilled the beans, and Charlie could do nothing but plead guilty.
He left behind a crying wife and a crying baby boy, and he didn't see him again for a long time, because after that gavel went down in that St. Louis courtroom, they carried him off to the middle of the state, up on the bluffs of the Missouri River, in a big old dank stone penitentiary, the Missouri State Penitentiary. And that's where Charlie did his time, and he did it hard.
Charlie ended up serving 3.5 years of a 5-year sentence. His time in Jefferson City, Missouri was probably the worst 3.5 years of Charlie's life.
There was correspondence for a time with Ruby on the outside, but that prison time spent up in Jeff City took a toll, and by the time he got out, she had divorced him. Ruby divorced Charlie Floyd, and went off and took off with a man who was good to her and good to her boy.
Jefferson City was a hellhole. I mean, just regular beatings and just one thing after another, and if you couldn't supply some money to some of the guards and so forth, you know, you would get you know what, details, and which was terrible. I'm sure it was a bad experience because he said he would never go back. He would never be taken alive again, and he never did.
But Charlie made use of his time in prison. He observed and learned a lot, all from the wrong people.
He spent all of his spare time discussing crime and robberies with some of the hardened cons and veteran criminals who were there in the prison. This was his education. In other words, in many ways, he failed prison, because by the time he was done, he was determined to renew his career on the outlaw trail, and this time to do it right.
Kansas City, a town ripe with corruption, crime, and loose morals. Also one of Charlie's first stops as a free man. It was here he earned his famous name, Pretty Boy.
The story goes that Floyd got his nickname one night while he was playing cards in Ash's boarding house. Beulah Baird, who was a really beautiful young woman, tall, buxom, quite a looker, sidled up to him, put a beer down in front of him, and said, "What's your name, pretty boy?" The name stuck, and Beulah stuck to Floyd.
Charlie and his new girlfriend appeared to live well despite economic downfall. It wasn't long before family members caught wind that something wasn't right.
I remember one time he had this real fancy automobile when I was just a young kid. Well, I thought that was really something. And that's when I guess, really realized that Charlie was making some money, probably illegally. Well, by that time, he'd robbed Earl's for a bank, the Maud Bank, and Tupelo Bank. He robbed banks for a living. He couldn't go back.
During that very busy year of 1930, mostly spent up in Ohio, finally Charlie was pinched by the authorities. This time for his high crimes and misdemeanors, they gave him 12 to 15 years to do in the big house. Under guard and put on a train, and was headed to that penitentiary. But in the darkness of night, on a speeding train, he kicked out the window, eluded his guards, and vaulted off into time and space, into that void, into that darkness, into the brush, into the Ohio countryside. Pretty boy escaped.
The press now caught on to the catchy name, Pretty Boy. Newspapers became flooded with stories of Charles, Pretty Boy Floyd.
He rises to prominence, he rises to fame against the backdrop of the most incredible economic downturn the nation has ever known, which hit the very region out of which he came the hardest of any part of America, which then, of course, was attacked by nature as well. It seemed as if everything, nature and man, was conspiring against these people. They looked for heroes wherever they could find them. And here's a local boy making good, robbing the enemy, robbing the banks, robbing those who prey upon them the most. No wonder they worship Charlie Floyd.
Though Charlie was a hero to many, he wasn't happy. He missed Ruby and his son Dempsey. Charlie tracked them down, and this once happy family instantly became reunited.
My mother and father, when I saw them together, they were, it was just great. They were in love, you could tell they were. And I used to go in before they get up. You know, kids usually get up before their parents. And I'd go in and look at them, and, excuse me, he'd always have his arm kind of around her. And it thrilled me to see them that way.
They took up residence in Fort Smith, Arkansas, out in a quiet little neighborhood, living under the alias of Jack Hamilton, Mr. and Mrs. Jack Hamilton and Son in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And he took on the disguise of a traveling salesman, a peddler, with his valises and bags and his old car driving around.
It was the best 6 months of my life that I can remember being with him. He did a lot of funny things. He teased my mother, and he cooked for us. He made spaghetti and meatballs, and he enjoyed cooking and doing things with us. Took me fishing and did everything that fathers usually do, wrestle around with me. And at night, he'd always take me to bed. He'd put me on his shoulders and take me in and throw me into bed, you know, like having fun with me.
Later on, when he moved over to Tulsa, he wasn't really a traveling salesman at all. The fact is, he was out robbing banks. He was doing what he knew how to do best. That's liberate hard cash and currency from the bankers who many folks insisted were on the wrong side of the law themselves.
Charlie always made sure his son had plenty of money and gave him many of the coins he obtained from banks.
He said, I'll tell you something. He said, there's a sack of coins underneath my bed. Anytime you want something, just come in and get your handful of money and go do it. So that was great. I had a lot of friends, you know, we'd always have money for ice cream, or we'd go to the show and stuff. And my mother discovered it, and she counted it all out and went down and bought me a suit with short pants, which was really a bad thing. You know, sissies only wore short pants, but that was the end of the money.
It was also the end of these sweet times, as Tulsa police began to close in on Charlie's whereabouts.
The police went over there, rumbling down the street in an armored truck with all kinds of weapons brandished and so forth. And of course, much to their chagrin, the phantom terror, old Charlie Floyd, Pretty Boy, and his partner slipped out the back door and disappeared into the